Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into what might be the ultimate mystery. Consciousness. Not just, the biological stuff happening in your brain, but that raw, undeniable feeling of being.
Yeah, that subjective what it's like.
Exactly. What it's like to see red or feel warmth or even just ponder your own existence. It's the most intimate thing we know, right?
Absolutely. And yet it's so incredibly hard to fit into our standard scientific picture of the world.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the sources we're diving into today really highlight the deep philosophical puzzles this throws up.
Oh, definitely. Think about the usual ways we try to tackle it. Physicalism, for instance.
Right, the idea that it's all just physical stuff, atoms, neurons firing.
Exactly. But that runs headfirst into what philosophers call the explanatory gap.
Ah, yeah. How do you get from, quantitative facts about brain activity, this neuron fired, that chemical was released, to the actual qualitative feeling, the first-person experience?
It feels like something fundamental is missing, doesn't it? You can imagine, conceptually at least, a perfect physical copy of you.
The zombie twin.
Right, the philosophical zombie. Acts just like you, talks like you, but inside, lights are off, no experience.
And the fact that we can even conceive of that zombie suggests the physical facts alone don't automatically guarantee the conscious facts. There's a gap.
Precisely. That's the classic hard problem right there.
Okay, so physicalism struggles. What about the other main contender, dualism?
Well, dualism says consciousness is something fundamentally non-physical. Separate from the brain, maybe interacting with it.
Like a ghost in the machine, sort of.
Kind of, but that runs smack into the causal exclusion problem.
Okay, explain that one again.
If the physical world is a causally closed system, every physical event, like a neuron firing, has a sufficient physical cause, like the neuron before it firing.
Then where does the non-physical mind step in to do anything?
Exactly. How does it interact? Does it, push physical buttons in the brain? If it does, where does the physical energy for that push come from? It seems to violate physics.
Or if it doesn't interact physically?
Then is it just along for the ride? Causally powerless. Just watching the show.
Epiphenomenal. A mere side effect with no effect of its own.
Right. The sources we're looking at really hammer home that these are deep, persistent roadblocks for both physicalism and dualism.
So, okay, if starting with non-conscious physical stuff leads to the explanatory gap, and starting with a separate non-physical mind leads to causal exclusion, what else is there?
Well, what if we flipped the script entirely?
How so?
What if consciousness wasn't something that just popped up late in the game, emerging from complex brains or existing in some separate spooky realm? What if it was actually fundamental, woven into the very fabric of reality right from the start?
Fundamental, meaning it's always been there in some form.
That's the core idea behind panpsychism. Consciousness, in some basic way, is ubiquitous. It's everywhere.
Okay, panpsychism. I know that's not just one single idea, though. It's more like a family of views.
That's right. Some versions say tiny particles have some kind of consciousness. That's micropsychism.
But the sources mentioned that has its own huge challenges, right? Which we'll probably get into.
Oh, absolutely. Big challenges. And that actually leads us directly to the specific and maybe pretty mind-bending theory we're really unpacking today.
Which is?
Hybrid cosmopsychism.
Hybrid cosmopsychism. Okay, that's a mouthful. Let's really lean into this. Our mission for this deep dive, then, is to get our heads around this specific theory, following the sources.
Yep.
What's its radical starting point? What are the mechanisms it says are responsible for your consciousness, the listener's consciousness, existing? And crucially, how does this whole kind of elaborate structure claim to solve those big problems, the explanatory gap, causal exclusion, that trip up the other theories?
Yeah, how does it try to navigate between those two rocks?
Let's see how it all fits together based on the material we have.
It's definitely a theory that forces you to rethink some basic assumptions about reality. It's a fascinating intellectual journey, even if you don't ultimately buy the whole picture.
All right, I'm intrigued. Let's jump in. Where does hybrid cosmopsychism begin? You said it's not particles?
No, it starts big, really big. It doesn't begin with particles or brains or even people. It starts with the entire universe.
The whole universe, okay.
Yes, this is the foundational move. The sources are really clear. The theory begins with cosmopsychism.
Cosmopsychism.
The universe itself is the single fundamental conscious subject. It is the ultimate, most basic bearer of experience in reality.
Okay, hold on. The universe is conscious. Not just that it contains consciousness, but the whole shebang as one single thing has its own conscious experience.
That's the claim.
Wow. Okay. That feels immediately, it's very intuitive. What does that even mean for the universe to be a subject?
It means the universe as a unified whole is the fundamental bearer of phenomenal properties. There is fundamentally a what it's like to be the
A
universe.
cosmic qualia.
You could put it that way. And yeah, it's a radical departure, like you said. It's not starting small with micropsychism or starting with non-conscious stuff like physicalism. It starts at the absolute top.
So instead of trying to figure out how consciousness somehow bubbles up from little bits or emerges from complex non-conscious things, this theory says, nope, it's already there, fully formed at the grandest possible scale.
Exactly. That's the starting point. And the sources connect this directly to a metaphysical position called priority monism.
Priority monism.
Okay. Now, our everyday intuition, and maybe a lot of how we think in science, is kind of based on what we might call a Lego theory of reality.
Right. You start with the smallest bits, atoms, particles, whatever, and everything bigger is just built up from those fundamental blocks.
Yeah. Facts about the big things are grounded in facts about the tiny components. Priority monism flips that completely on its head.
It's the opposite of the Lego theory.
Pretty much. Priority monism argues that the entire universe is metaphysically prior to the parts.
The whole comes first.
Yes. Facts about the parts, like you or me or this planet, are grounded in or derived from facts about the whole universe. The universe is the maximal entity, and everything else is, in some sense, dependent on it or a modification of it.
How does that fit with physics? Doesn't physics usually focus on fundamental particles?
Well, the sources note that this view actually fits quite nicely with certain interpretations of modern physics, like quantum field theory.
Oh, interesting. How so?
In QFT, the fundamental entities aren't really localized particles in the old sense. They're universe-wide fields. Particles are more like excitations or patterns within these fields.
Ah, okay. So the fundamental reality is already kind of holistic field-based.
You could argue that yes, and if reality is fundamentally these universe-wide fields...
Then maybe consciousness is too. Like a universe-wide experiential field that somehow corresponds to those physical fields.
That is precisely the key identification the sources make. They propose an identification of physical structure with experiential structure.
Physical structure is experiential structure.
Yes. Physics describes the structure of the universe, the patterns of excitation in these fields, their interactions, the laws governing them. Hybrid cosmopsychism posits that this very physical structure is the structure of the universe subject's experience.
So when physicists map out the space-time manifold, or describe the quantum vacuum, they are, unknowingly perhaps, literally describing the shape and dynamics of the universe's own consciousness.
That's the radical idea. It draws on insights from Russellian panpsychism.
Which has?
Russellianism suggests physics tells us about the relational causal properties of fundamental stuff, what it does, how it interacts, but it's totally silent on its intrinsic nature, what it is in itself.
Right, the hidden essence of matter.
Exactly. This theory identifies that hidden intrinsic nature of the fundamental cosmic fields with consciousness, with the universe's own experience. So the fields aren't just physical structures, they are the experiential substance of the universe. And physics is describing the patterns within that cosmic experience.
Wow. So the laws of physics are, in a way, the laws of the universe's thought or experience.
That's a way to think about it. The very fabric of reality described by physics is, at its deepest level, fundamentally experiential. It's quite a picture.
It really is. Okay, so recapping. Conscious universe as the fundamental subject, top-down priority monism, physical structure is its experiential structure. Why go to all this trouble? What specific problem does this whole setup supposedly solve better than, say, starting small with particles?
The main motivation, according to the sources, is to get around the infamous combination problem.
Ah, yes. The big headache for micropsychism. If you start with billions of tiny, simple conscious particles in my brain, how on earth do they combine to create my single, unified, incredibly complex experience? Just adding up simple things doesn't seem to give you complexity or unity.
Precisely. The sources highlight a couple of key aspects of this problem. First, there's the structural mismatch problem.
Structural mismatch.
Yeah. How do you get the incredibly intricate relational structure of our consciousness, which seems tied to the complex organization of the brain, just by aggregating these simple intrinsic properties of fundamental particles? Simple points don't automatically form complex networks just by being put together.
Right, you can pile up Lego bricks, but you don't automatically get a detailed model spaceship with interconnected parts. You need a plan. Relationship.
Exactly. And related to that is the palette problem.
The palette problem. Like colors.
Kind of. How do you get the sheer diversity and richness of human subjective experience? The specific feeling of seeing blue, the taste of coffee, the nuances of joy or sorrow from the presumably very simple, very limited range of qualities that fundamental particle experiences might have, if they even have qualities like that.
It's like trying to paint a masterpiece using only like 3 primary colors. You just don't have the range, the necessary palette.
That's the analogy. Micropsychism struggles to build both the right kind of complex structure and the rich variety of qualities from the ground up.
So how does starting with a conscious universe help here?
By starting with a conscious universe field that already underlies the entire structure of physics, you start with a base that is inherently richly structured and, presumably, qualitatively diverse. Physics itself describes immense complexity.
Ah, so the complexity and richness are already there at the fundamental level, in the cosmic consciousness that is the physical structure.
That's the idea. The sources argue this shifts the problem. Instead of a combination problem, how do you build complexity up from simple parts? It becomes more like a decombination or thinning out problem.
Decombination, you mean how do you get the parts out of the whole?
Exactly. How do you differentiate or derive local subjects like us with our specific limited experiences from that vastly complex pre-existing cosmic consciousness?
So the challenge flips from building up to carving out.
Yes. It reframes the whole challenge. How do specific, localized conscious experiences arise as differentiations within the cosmic whole, rather than being built from non-conscious or microconscious bits? The sources see this as a potentially more tractable problem.
Okay, that's a significant shift in perspective. So universe is the conscious whole, avoids the combination problem by starting complex. But clearly, we aren't the entire conscious universe. I'm me, you're you, the listener is them. We feel like distinct, local conscious subjects. How do we arise? How do we get carved out of that cosmic whole? This must be where the hybrid part of hybrid cosmopsychism comes in.
This is absolutely the crucial next step. And yes, this is where the theory gets hybrid, because it employs 2 distinct types of emergence to explain how local subjects like us come into being and have the specific experiences we do.
2 different kinds of emergence. Okay, that sounds intricate. Let's take the first one.
The first is strong emergence about conscious subjects.
Song emergence.
Yeah.
4 subjects. Okay.
Remember, subjects are the entities that have experiences, the bearers of phenomenal properties. The theory posits that there are basic laws of nature, fundamental laws, just like gravity or electromagnetism might be, but maybe a different kind of law that specifically ensures certain complex physical configurations.
Like our brains.
Like functioning animal brains, yes. That these configurations become distinct, local conscious subjects.
So it's not just a coincidence that brains are conscious. This theory says there are fundamental rules of the universe that say, when physical system X reaches this kind of complexity or organization, poof, it becomes its own conscious subject.
Precisely. Poof might be a bit informal, but yes, it's necessitated by law. And this emergence of subjects is called strong emergence because you can't just deduce it from the laws governing the underlying physical components alone. It requires these additional fundamental laws about subject formation.
They're part of the basic furniture of reality, these subject emergence laws.
That's the idea. They specify the conditions under which distinct subjects differentiate or emerge from the background conscious universe. The sources refer to this requirement for such laws as the localization principle.
The localization principle.
Yeah.
Basically, a demand that reality includes laws that localize consciousness into subjects.
Exactly. It ensures that we get parts out of the whole, addressing that decombination problem for subjects we mentioned earlier.
Right. If you could imagine a conscious universe just staying a uniform whole, these laws are what force it to break up into localized pockets of subjecthood, like us.
That's the role they play. They provide the necessary metaphysical link to get conscious parts from the conscious whole.
Okay, so subjects strongly emerge via fundamental laws. That's emergence type 1. What's the second type?
The second type is weak emergence, specifically about phenomenal properties.
Phenomenal properties, the actual what it's like stuff. The redness of red, the feeling of pain.
Yes, the qualia themselves. And here's the absolutely critical point the sources make. When these local subjects emerge, they do not generate new, independent, phenomenal properties.
Wait, they don't create their own experiences. Then how do they have experiences? If I stub my toe, where does the feeling of pain come from if my newly emerged subjectness doesn't generate it?
According to the theory, they inherit them.
Inherit.
Yes, they inherit instances of phenomenal properties that were already present in that physical location, being born by the universe subject.
So the universe was already experiencing a sort of proto-pain in that location, corresponding to the physical events in my foot and nerves.
Essentially, yes. The specific instance of the phenomenal property, that particular token of pain, was already there as part of the universe's incredibly detailed experience in that region of space-time corresponding to your body's activity.
And when I emerge as a local subject tied to that body.
Then, according to the strong emergence laws, you take over bearing that exact numerically identical property instance. It's transferred to you.
So the experience itself already existed, fundamentally, as part of the universe's consciousness. My emergence as a subject just changes who is experiencing it.
That's the core idea. And this inheritance of pre-existing properties is considered weak emergence regarding the properties themselves.
Why weak?
Because you're not creating fundamentally new types of qualia or new property instances from scratch. The property instance was already part of the fundamental reality, the universe's experience. The only change is the bearer of that instance. It was the universe, now it's the local subject.
Okay. Wow. That's a very specific division of labor. Strong emergence uses laws to create the subject, the experiencer. Weak emergence then explains the experience itself, not by creation, but by inheriting or transferring pre-existing qualities from the universe.
That is the heart of the hybrid approach, strong for subjects, weak for their properties.
Let's dig into that inheritance mechanism more. The sources call it qualia transference. This sounds absolutely central.
It is. It's the linchpin for several parts of the theory. Qualia transference is defined as a metaphysical process where a single phenomenal property instance gets transferred from one subject, the universe, to another, a local emergent subject.
It's a single instance. So not just a similar feeling, but the exact same token of feeling.
Yes. The sources emphasize this strongly. It's not like one instance disappears and a qualitatively identical copy pops up elsewhere. It's the numerically identical token instance that changes its bearer.
They use an example, don't they?
They do the example of a witch transferring her headache. It's that specific headache, the numerically same one, that moves from the witch to the person she curses. It's a vivid, if maybe slightly unsettling, analogy.
Okay, so applying that here, the universe is having an incredibly complex experience corresponding to the physical activity in my brain region when I emerge as a subject there.
Then, via qualia transference, the numerically identical phenomenal property instances, the specific tokens of color, sound, thought, feeling, etc., that were previously born by the universe subject in that exact location, are transferred to be born by you, the local subject.
It's like the universe hands off a specific bundle of its own experience to me, the newly formed subject occupying that spot.
That's a good way to put it. You temporarily take over experiencing that particular stream of qualia.
But the sources say this is ongoing, as my brain state changes.
Yes. As the local subject persists, it's continuously gaining and losing these property instances, these tropes, from the universe around its dynamic physical boundaries.
And when the subject ceases to exist, like at death,
then the properties it was bearing are relinquished back. They revert to being born solely by the universe subject again.
Okay, like checking out a very specific, dynamic book of experience from the cosmic library. You get to read it, maybe even contribute to its changes for a while, and then it goes back to the main collection when your time as a distinct reader is up.
That analogy captures the temporary bearing relationship quite well. Now, for this whole mechanism of transference to even make sense metaphysically, the sources stress a necessary metaphysical commitment. Phenomenal properties must be tropes, not universals.
Tropes. Okay, we need to pause here. This sounds critical.
Yeah.
Remind us of the difference and why it matters so much for transference.
It matters completely. So when philosophers talk about properties like redness or painfulness, there are different views on what they fundamentally are. One major view is realism about universals.
Right. Redness is one abstract thing, and lots of different objects can share it or instantiate it. My red shirt, your red car.
Exactly. But on many versions of this view, the instances of redness, the specific redness of this shirt, the specific redness of that car, are seen as inherently tied to the object that has them. They are distinct instances because they belong to distinct objects.
So under the universal view, even if my headache felt exactly like your headache, they'd still be two different instances of the universal headache-ness just because they belong to different people.
Correct. And if instances are tied to their bearers like that, you can't have the numerically same instance change bearers. It wouldn't make sense.
Okay. So how does trope theory differ?
Trope theory says properties aren't abstract universals. They are particular individual instances. They are the instances. So the redness of this specific shirt is a distinct entity, a trope, from the redness of that specific but maybe identical looking shirt.
So properties are like individual little packets of quality. This specific packet of redness, that specific packet of pain.
That's a common way to visualize them, yes. Individual, non-repeatable particulars. And crucially for this theory, tropes are generally understood in metaphysics as being capable, at least in principle, of changing their bearers. This specific redness trope could stop belonging to object A and start belonging to object B if the laws of reality allowed it.
Ah, there it is. The light bulb moment. If you want the numerically identical token of experience, the which is actual headache trope, to move from the universe to me, then phenomenal properties have to be these individual, movable things. They have to be tropes.
Precisely. The sources state this is a non-negotiable commitment for hybrid cosmopsychism. Qualia transference is the engine driving local experience, and that engine requires phenomenal properties to be tropes. Without tropes, the transference mechanism, as described, just doesn't work.
So buying into this theory means buying into trope theory for qualia. Got it. Now, you said qualia transference is also the key to solving a major problem.
Yes, it's specifically designed to address the causal exclusion problem.
Let's recap that hurdle again quickly, just so we're clear what's being solved.
Right. The problem, if the physical world is causally closed, physical event A causes physical event B causes physical event C, and that's the whole story physically.
Then what causal work is left for consciousness to do? If my neurons firing are sufficient to make my arm move, what does my feeling of wanting to move my arm add to the causal chain?
Exactly. For dualism, the non-physical mind seems either redundant or it has to somehow intervene in physics, which looks problematic. For other theories, where consciousness strongly emerges as a new property, you'd expect that new property to make a difference to how the physical system behaves, compared to a system without it. But empirically, that doesn't seem to happen. Systems that we think are conscious seem to follow the same physical laws as systems we think aren't.
Okay, so how does qualia transference, tied to this weak emergence of properties, let hybrid cosmopsychism have its cake and eat it too? Have consciousness be real, but not mess up physics?
This is presented as one of the theory's major selling points. When a local subject emerges and inherits properties via qualia transference, it does not introduce any new fundamental properties or new causal forces into that physical location.
Because the properties, the phenomenal tropes, were already there.
They were already there, identified with the intrinsic nature of the fundamental physical fields in that location.
And the causal powers are associated with those fundamental fields themselves, right? With their physical aspect.
Yes, the causal powers, what the fields do, physically, are tied to the fundamental properties which are the universe's experience. When transference happens,
The properties and their causal powers stay put.
they stay in the exact same physical location, they don't move, their nature doesn't change, their causal role in the physical unfolding of events doesn't change.
So the only thing that changes is who is experiencing them, the universe or the local subject.
That's the claim. The bearer changes, but the properties themselves and their associated place in the physical causal structure remain identical.
I think I'm getting it. It's clever. Because the causal oomph is already part of the fundamental physical experiential reality at that location. And it stays exactly where it is, doing what it always does physically. The emergence of me as a subject and the transfer of who is feeling those properties adds nothing new to the physical causal story.
Right. The system behaves identically physically, whether it's the universe experiencing that bundle of tropes or the local subject experiencing them.
It's like changing the name tag on a machine operator without changing how the machine runs.
That's a decent analogy. This mechanism ensures the physical causal sequence remains undisturbed, which aligns with empirical observations. This is how the theory aims to satisfy the external constraint being consistent with empirical data, specifically the apparent causal closure of physics.
It integrates consciousness deeply but stealthily from a causal perspective.
That's the goal. It avoids making consciousness an inert byproduct or a physics-violating interloper.
Very neat. Now, earlier you mentioned the inherited experience is a thinned-out version of the universe's total experience in that location. This involves the thinning principle, right?
Correct. Qualia transference is the how properties move. The thinning principle addresses which properties move and why.
Okay.
The idea is that the universe's experience corresponding to a complex physical system like a brain is unimaginably rich and detailed. It corresponds to all the physical fine-grained details of the fundamental fields in that volume.
Which would be overwhelming. My conscious experience definitely isn't that. I'm not aware of every quantum fluctuation in my visual cortex when I see a cat.
Exactly. Thankfully not. The thinning principle states that there are basic laws, potentially the same ones, governing subject emergence, or closely related, that ensure the emergent local subject inherits only a specific subset of the cosmic experience, a thinned-out version.
Thinned out based on what? How is the selection made?
The laws select and transfer only those phenomenal tropes that realize or support certain higher-level information structures within the physical system that are thought to be crucial for consciousness.
Higher level information structures. Like what?
The sources give examples, like structures supporting high integrated information, if you're using something like the IIT model we mentioned, or perhaps structures related to a global workspace architecture. The specific structure isn't mandated by the core theory, but the principle is that some such structure guides the thinning.
Okay, so let me try to visualize this. The universe's experience in my brain's location is like a massive, unfiltered flood of raw experiential data corresponding to every physical detail. The thinning principle acts like a sophisticated filter, maybe, defined by laws linked to, say, integrated information patterns. It only lets through those specific phenomenal tropes that correspond to the high patterns in my brain, and that filtered subset becomes my conscious experience.
That's a very good way to put it using the IIT example. This selective inheritance, this thinning, is what gives local subjects like us our particular structure, our specific level of detail, and the specific qualitative content of our experience.
And this helps with those other problems too, right?
Yep. Yes. The sources argue this addresses the structural mismatch problem. You get complex structure in local consciousness because you're selecting complex, higher-level structures from the already structured cosmic base via thinning. And it starts to address the palette problem. You get the diverse qualities of human experience by selectively inheriting from the incredibly rich palette of the fundamental cosmic qualities, again guided by the thinning laws, rather than trying to build diverse qualia from hypothesized simple microqualia.
Okay, this is quite a machine. Let's try to quickly assemble pieces again. We've got 1, conscious universe, cosmopsychism, priority modernism, physical structure, experiential structure. 2, local subjects, like us, strongly emerge via fundamental localization laws. 3, these subjects get their experiences via weak emergence of properties through qualia transference. 4, this transference involves inheriting pre-existing phenomenal tropes from the universe. 5, the inheritance is selective, guided by a thinning principle linked to high-level structures like IIT. 6, and the whole qualia transference bit is key to avoiding the causal exclusion problem.
You've nailed the core architecture. It's a highly interconnected system of ideas.
So let's zoom back out. We started by mentioning the big philosophical roadblocks, the explanatory gap and causal exclusion. How does this whole intricate hybrid cosmopsychism structure claim to specifically overcome those? Let's start with the explanatory gap.
Okay. Remember the gap. For physicalism, it's hard to see why physical facts should necessitate subjective, qualitative facts. Zombies seem conceivable.
Right.
The sources argue that purely weak emergentist versions of panpsychism also face their own versions of this gap.
No, so we touched on this, but maybe elaborate.
Well, a weak emergentist micropsychism faces the micro-experiential zombie argument. You could imagine, arguably, a system made of conscious particles all interacting, but where the whole system itself doesn't form a single unified conscious subject. The conscious parts don't automatically guarantee a conscious whole. There's a gap.
Okay, micro doesn't guarantee macro subjectivity.
And a purely weak emergentist cosmopsychism faces the decombination problem as its gap. You can conceive of a conscious universe that just remains a conscious universe without any distinct localized subjects like us ever differentiating within it. Why should parts become subjects?
A conscious ocean with no distinct waves of individual experience also seems conceivable.
Exactly. So just having consciousness at the fundamental level, micro or cosmic, in a purely weak emergent way, doesn't seem on its own to necessitate the existence of local subjects like us with our structured experiences. There's still an explanatory gap between fundamental consciousness and local consciousness.
So how does hybrid cosmopsychism bridge this gap, this decombination problem?
Through its strong emergentism about subjects, that's the crucial move.
The fundamental laws.
Yes. By positing those basic laws of nature, the localization principle realized laws that specifically necessitate the emergence of conscious subjects when certain physical conditions are met. The theory provides the necessary link that physicalism and purely weak emergentist views lack.
The laws force the localization to happen. They bridge the gap by decree, essentially.
By fundamental decree, yes. The
Okay.
argument is, given the conscious universe plus these basic laws, it is not conceivable that subjects would fail to emerge in the right systems. So, facts about us being conscious subjects with thinned experiences become deducible in principle from the fundamental facts, conscious universe, plus these basic laws of emergence and inheritance.
Okay, so it starts with consciousness, cosmic, and as laws to explain its localization. That's how it aims to satisfy the internal constraint, avoiding explanatory gaps by making local consciousness necessary given the base plus the laws.
Exactly. The laws provide the necessary conceptual connection.
And the causal exclusion problem again. We hammered this with qualia transference, but let's just quickly restate the solution in this context.
Right. It's solved via the weak emergentism inheritance about phenomenal properties because local subjects inherit pre-existing tropes rather than creating new properties.
And those tropes are the intrinsic nature of physical fields whose causal powers remain unchanged.
The emergence of the local subject and the transference of properties doesn't alter the physical causal chain. Physics proceeds exactly as it would have anyway.
Which matches observation. So, consistency with the external constraint.
Precisely. It avoids causal redundancy or epiphenomenalism for consciousness.
So that dual structure, strong emergence for subjects solving the gap, weak emergence for properties via transference solving exclusion, is the tightrope walk the theory performs between the two main problems.
That's the core argument presented in the sources, yes.
Okay. This is, well, it's philosophically dense, but the sources suggest it's not just navel-gazing, right? It's meant to connect to science somehow. How does hybrid cosmopsychism actually touch the empirical world?
This is where it gets interesting and maybe a bit speculative. The theory calls for philosophically informed science. Meaning the theory sets up the framework. It says there must be basic laws for localization, subject emergence, and thinning, property inheritance. But it doesn't tell us exactly what those laws are.
It gives the job description for the laws, but not the laws themselves.
Pretty much. Figuring out the specific form of those laws, what kinds of physical systems become subjects? What specific higher-level structures guide the thinning? That's presented as a job for science, guided by the philosophical framework. Philosophy says what's needed. Science looks for the empirical regularities that fit the bill.
And the sources provide an example of what this might look like in practice.
Yes, they use a modified version of integrated information theory, IIT, purely as an illustrative example.
Just to show how it could work, not saying it is IIT.
Exactly, it's conditional. But if you adopted an IIT-like framework, then the localization law might be a system is a subject if and only if it has maximal integrated information relative to its components and embedding systems. Maximal, though, is the condition for subjecthood in this specific model. And the thinning law might be the subject inherits those phenomenal tropes from the cosmic experience that realize or support the system's high structure.
So under this illustrative IIT model, my brain is a subject because it hits maximal toe, and my experience consists of those cosmic qualia filtered by my brain's patterns.
That's the picture painted by that specific example. It provides a concrete candidate for the kind of laws the theory requires.
How does this connect to empirical plausibility then? Does using IIT give it some scientific grounding?
There are a few points here. First, the big one we keep coming back to, consistency with causal closure.
Right. Qualia transference means it doesn't mess with physics. That makes it plausible on its face.
It removes a major potential conflict with empirical science. Second, there's predictive alignment via IIT. If you assume the IIT-based laws are right, then the theory predicts consciousness where IIT predicts it plausibly in complex brains with high-ho. Since standard IIT aims to align its predictions with neuroscience data about where consciousness occurs.
Hybrid cosmopsychism via IIT kind of piggybacks on that attempt at empirical alignment.
Indirectly, yes. If IIT turns out to be good at predicting the neural correlates of consciousness, then the IIT-based hybrid cosmopsychism gains some reflected plausibility for its proposed laws.
And the sources also mentioned empirical indiscernibility.
Yeah, the point made is that IIT might be empirically indistinguishable from standard IIT in terms of its predictions about which systems are conscious and what their structure is like. So any empirical evidence neuroscience provides for standard IIT could be interpreted as indirect support for the IIT-based laws within hybrid cosmopsychism, too. It doesn't prove the underlying metaphysics, but it could support the form of the laws.
Okay, so it's plausible because it respects physical causality and can potentially link up with empirical models like IIT. But can it be tested? Can science ever prove it wrong? What about indirect falsifiability?
Directly testing the universe is conscious or tropes are transferring looks, well, incredibly difficult, maybe impossible with current science.
Yeah, I can't imagine the experiment for that.
Right, but the theory grounds subject emergence and thinning in laws that are, in principle, linked to empirical criteria, like the maximal who in the IIT example.
So you test the laws, the proposed link between the metaphysics and the physical world.
Exactly. If a candidate law, like the IIT GIST one, makes specific predictions, systems with maximal O are conscious subjects, systems without it are not, then those predictions could potentially be tested.
Ow.
Well, you could have falsification of the candidate law. Maybe future neuroscience or AI research creates a system that, according to IIT calculations, definitely has maximal O, but it seems blindingly obvious it's not conscious at all, like a cleverly designed circuit.
Or the opposite, find clear consciousness in a system that IIT says should not have maximal low.
Precisely. The sources suggest that such findings would challenge, or potentially falsify, that specific IIT-based law as the correct implementation of the localization principle.
So science, or even maybe philosophical analysis of edge cases, could shoot down specific proposals for how the principles are realized.
Exactly. And the sources explicitly bring up tricky cases for subject persistence under the IIT-based model as another pressure point.
We touched on this. If subjecthood is having maximal O, what happens during brain changes or splits or uploads?
Right. If applying the maximal criterion leads to really weird or counterintuitive results about personal identity, like saying you wink out of existence and a new subject appears every time your brain slightly reorganizes, or that brain fission creates two subjects where there was one, then the philosophical awkwardness of those consequences casts doubt on whether maximal hay is the right criterion.
So the philosophical implications of applying the proposed law can challenge the law itself.
Yes. The sources explicitly state that the difficulty in giving a satisfying account of subject identity using maximal dynamics could give grounds for doubting IIT as the correct framework for the emergent laws. That's a clear example of how the specific proposed link to an empirical measure can be scrutinized and potentially rejected.
That shows it's not completely Teflon-coated against criticism, even if the core metaphysics is hard to test directly.
It suggests the interface between the metaphysics and the proposed scientific laws is where empirical and conceptual challenges can arise.
What are the limits here, though? If IIT gets falsified as the law,
That doesn't kill hybrid cosmopsychism itself. It just means that specific candidate law was wrong. The core theory, conscious universe, strong subject emergence, weak property inheritance via transference, could potentially survive by proposing a different law, maybe based on a different scientific theory of consciousness, that still fits the localization and thinning principles.
so the core metaphysical picture is quite resilient, but its specific scientific implementations are vulnerable.
That seems to be the view presented. The ultimate empirical traction depends on whether any testable laws can be successfully formulated within the framework.
Okay, we have covered a lot of ground, from a conscious cosmos down to the nuts and bolts of qualia transference, how it tries to solve the big problems, and how it might connect, however indirectly, to science. It's a really unique picture of reality.
It certainly is.
Let's step back one last time. What are the big takeaways, the broader philosophical implications, and the challenges that remain, according to the sources?
Well, first, it's clear the theory demands some major metaphysical commitments from you if you adopt it.
Right, recap those for us.
You're signing up for 1. Cosmopsychism, priority monism. The universe is the fundamental conscious subject. The whole is prior to the parts. Your existence is derivative. 2. Trope theory. Phenomenal properties, qualia, are individual transferable instances. 3. Dual emergence. Subjects emerge strongly via laws. Their properties are weakly inherited via transference.
That's a hefty ontological package. And it fundamentally reframes the problem of consciousness, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It shifts the main challenge away from the bottom-up combination problem, how do simple bits make complexity, towards a top-down decombination problem.
How do you carve out distinct local subjects and their specific experiences from the already complex conscious whole?
Precisely. And the proposed answer involves that whole apparatus. Strong subject emergence laws plus weak property inheritance thinning.
You're not building consciousness from scratch. You're differentiating it from a pre-existing conscious field.
Exactly. But, as we discussed, significant challenges remain. One major one is subject persistence and identity.
The tricky cases again.
Yes. If subjecthood is tied to dynamic physical conditions, like maximal hay in the example, defining personal identity over time becomes really complex and potentially counterintuitive. What makes you the same subject from one moment to the next through constant brain changes, or even hypothetical fission or fusion events?
The theory seems to imply our sense of a stable, enduring self might be more complicated or perhaps even illusory, depending on how those laws actually work.
It definitely pushes questions of personal identity to the forefront, linking them directly to the fundamental dynamics of the conscious universe. The sources highlight this as needing much more work.
And the other challenge.
Fully working out the quality decombination problem.
Meaning,
even if you grant the thinning principle selects some subset of cosmic qualia, precisely how does this selection process result in the specific, structured, and bounded range of qualities that make up human experience? How does the vast, maybe undifferentiated qualitative richness of the universe get parceled out and organized into these specific tastes, colors, emotions, thoughts?
how does the universal palette get used to paint my specific picture?
Exactly. The sources acknowledge that the fine-grained details of how the thinning laws sculpt the qualitative landscape of local experience are complex and perhaps beyond our current full understanding. It's another area flagged for future work within the theory.
So the framework is there, but fleshing out the exact content and consequences of those crucial localization and thinning laws is still a major task.
It's the task left for that philosophically informed science, should the overall metaphysical framework prove compelling.
Okay, so we've taken this deep dive into hybrid cosmopsychism,
Mm-hmm.
a truly fascinating, if complex, theory. It starts with this radical idea of a conscious universe, priority monism, physical structure being cosmic experience. Then it brings in basic laws for the strong emergence of local subjects like us. And it explains our experiences through weak emergence inheriting pre-existing phenomenal tropes from the universe via qualia transference, all selectively filtered or thinned out based on principles potentially linked to things like information structures.
And this whole elaborate structure, this hybrid model, is explicitly engineered to try and navigate between the scylla of the explanatory gap that plagues physicalism and the charybdis of causal exclusion that troubles dualism. It argues it can provide the necessary explanations while staying friends with physics. It reframes the problem from combination to decombination and makes some big metaphysical bets on things like priority monism and trope theory.
And while it sets up a program for science to potentially find the specific laws, and any specific proposal for those laws could face tough empirical or conceptual tests, the core metaphysical vision itself is a really profound shift in thinking about where consciousness fits in the grand scheme of things.
It fundamentally challenges the idea that consciousness is just this localized phenomenon inside skulls. It paints it as something much more deeply integrated into the cosmos itself, just temporarily focused and differentiated in systems like us.
And here's where it gets really mind-bending, maybe even a bit personal for you listening. If this theory, or something like it, is right, think about what it means for your consciousness, that feeling of being you right now. It's not something your brain cooked up entirely on its own from non-conscious bits. It's not built from the ground up. Instead, it's a specific, filtered, temporarily borrowed piece of the universe's own fundamental experience.
A localized ripple in the cosmic ocean of awareness.
Exactly. A pattern of cosmic qualia, shaped and selected by the physical structures in your head, governed by fundamental laws that determine which slice of the universe's infinite consciousness you get to experience as you for this brief time.
Suggests your mind isn't just in the universe, it's fundamentally of the universe's own consciousness.
So what does that do to your sense of self? Your connection to everything else? Are you truly separate, or are you more like a temporary focal point, a complex standing wave, an underlying universal awareness? It really forces you to reconsider who, or maybe even what, you fundamentally are.
Definitely something profound to ponder as you continue your own deep dives into the nature of reality.